Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. As we embark on a federal election, I think we've got to give a lot of thought, not just to the political parties, but some of the policies that these political parties and the new government of Canada is going to be following. And one of them, in addition to, clearly our relationship with the United States in regards to trade, is a relationship with the United States and our allies around the rest of the world in regards to defense and military spending. There was a fascinating series of columns over the course of the weekend that dealt with this, and we're going to interview Philippe Lagasse about this in just a few minutes. But I wanted to put it in context, if I could, because really what Canada has enjoyed over the course of the last 80 years, 40 years, is a peace dividend. Because of the end of World War II and then the end of the Cold War, and then really the American security system that provided a cover to Canada. And so therefore, particularly in the last 30, 40 years, we've reduced our spending on military and defense because we thought the Americans would protect us. And we depended on NATO, we depended on NORAD, we depended on the American security blanket, I think is what some people have called it, which is completely inappropriate, but that's sort of what it was. And we have not kept up with our commitments to fund 2% of our GDP on defense, and we're in a pickle, in a very difficult position right now. And some of the articles this past couple of days have been really fascinating because they've been suggesting that we have to rethink things in regards to our relationship with the United States and what we can expect, and can we depend on them to defend us? Can we depend on jets that have got the computer codes in the United States? Can we depend on NORAD and military establishments that have their loyalty to the United States and to the Pentagon and to the White House? Can we depend on submarines, on the Northwest Passage defense, etc., that is dependent on a country, at least on an administration right now of that country, that appears more interested in taking us over, annexing us, using economic coercion than it does on what historically has been our almost certain position, which is that we're in it together. We're no longer, it would appear, in it together. And then the interesting thing as well is this idea that we can't count on things to change in 2 years at the midterms elections, or 4 years, when this administration is up for either a re-election if Trump stays, or continuation if Donald Jr. or J.D. Vance or other people want to continue the mantle. That this could continue, and frankly, even if someone else comes in, will this attitude in the United States have permanently been changed? And do we have to plan today based on the potentiality that might exist? And so this is going to be a really interesting conversation today, and I look forward to the conversation with some experts on what Canada needs to do from a defense standpoint. Be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. And I'm joined by our expert, Philippe Lagasse, who is an associate professor at Carleton University, and he's the Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. And he's one of the co-authors of this article that I mentioned. And the title, Wanted, New Allies. Successive Canadian governments have leveraged our close relationship with Washington to get the most out of our low defense spending. This long-standing approach cannot continue. The United States is not the country it was a few months ago. Philippe Lagasse, professor, welcome to the show. Tell me, what motivated you to write this article?
Well, it's part of a series of conversations that my co-author and I, Peter Jones, have had with former senior military people over the past few months. And what we noticed was really that there was a pretty strong mindset that this too shall pass. That the Trump administration is simply an aberration, and that Canada's future lies squarely with the United States. And if anything, we should be doubling down on that relationship. and really making Canada the strongest possible ally it can be of the United States. And that will ward off the threats from President Trump. I think Peter and I both came to the same conclusion that we understand that perspective. We get why the CAF leadership feels that way. It's historically rooted. It's been our reality for decades. But we couldn't help but feel that this is just a different moment. uh, we have a president who is threatening us economically, has mused about annexing us, clearly has some intent towards us, be it in the Arctic, our resources, perhaps to divide us, whatever it is. We have a U.S. administration that is cozying up to Vladimir Putin in Russia and abandoning both Ukraine and potentially Europe, and has even mused about kicking us out of the North American Aerospace Defense Command and ceasing the intelligence sharing arrangements with us. So in light of all this, we said, it's time to rethink this relationship. It's going to be tough, and it's going to be really difficult for people who've spent an entire career and generation viewing themselves through the prism of the American alliance, but Canada needs a different path.
So it's interesting in the article, you talk about sort of some of the institutional realities that I'm not sure everyone in Canada, actually, I'm convinced not many people in Canada realize how involved that is and how deep it is. You mentioned CAF. I presume that's Canadian Armed Forces?
Yes, the CAF. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit, if you could, of some of the integration. You talked about NORAD. You talked about similar equipment. Tell us, just to brief us a little bit, if you could, to give us the background about how intertwined the Canadian Armed Forces are with the Americans.
So let's first start historically, just to put some of this in context. So coming out of the Second World War and into the Korean War and the aftermath of that conflict, Canada had effectively a self-sufficient military. So much so that it was able to have a permanent base in Western Europe, maintain even American nuclear weapons on some of our fighters. We were able to, for some time, really maintain a fairly self-sufficient force. As military equipment got much more expensive and technology advanced, and our defense spending started to decline slowly as a percentage of GDP, which really dates as of 1957, we started seeing this slow decline. We started to look elsewhere to find economies of scale. How do you reduce the cost of your armed forces? And one of those was really partnering with a lot of major American equipment manufacturing firms and leveraging that partnership. And that really took off in earnest, in particular after the budget cuts of the early 1990s, which saw the Department of National Defense and military get cut by about 30%. At which point, when you have such a small defense budget and you're still trying to figure out how to play a role in the world and how to make the most of that dollar, right, of the very few dollars that you have, it makes a lot of sense to effectively structure your force to become a bit of a subset of a much larger military. And that's really what we ended up doing. We ended up creating
close allies, and we're looking for efficiency and the power of the dollar spent. That all makes sense.
No, it does, right? And I think a lot of us in the community, the defense community, supported it. It made perfect sense. Why Canada's not going to develop its own jet fighters. It's not going to develop a lot of its own plays. It's not going to pay for a lot of the non-recurring engineering, a lot of this stuff. What you do is you leverage what a much larger ally is doing, which is what we did. And the end result was that you create an armed force which is kind of tailor-made to work with the U.S. military, both within North America through NORAD and overseas. So the Canadian Armed Forces, I don't think most Canadians recognize this, wouldn't be able to mount independent operations without the assistance of a larger ally.
What? Hold it. Say that again.
Yeah.
We would not be able to do? We wouldn't be able to
mount a major international operation without U.S. assistance.
From an intelligence standpoint,
everything, logistics, satellite communications, munitions, intelligence data, you name it, right? Just take a simple one, which is connectivity, right? Satellite communication. We don't have our own military satellite communication capability. We plug in and we buy into American constellations. This is just what we do. It makes a lot more sense, right? It made sense for all the allies to kind of see it that way. we bring things to the table, and we're a very capable armed force, as we saw in Afghanistan. But we're a lean machine, right? And what we've done is decided that, in order to maximize kind of the pointy end and to get the most out of what we're spending, we're going to assume that the US is covering over a bunch of things.
So, for an example, our new prime minister has tried to establish closer relations in the last week with Europe, and has sort of been talking about being part of this community of the committed or willing to participate in securing Ukraine. If we and European allies wanted to do something in Ukraine that the Americans didn't, could we?
We'd have difficulty, but we could. I think one thing to recognize is, yes, Russia is an immense threat, and it's a very significant military power despite being a small economy. But the Ukrainians have been able to hold off the Russians for nearly 3 years now, right? If not more. So if you add the entire kind of European defense apparatus and the Canadian, you have a good fighting chance. I don't think we're talking about prevailing here, but at the very least, you have a fairly strong deterrent effect. It'll be much more difficult without the United States. I mean, we're talking about having the support that the Ukrainians have and potentially taking away some key intelligence and other logistical support. But we could do it. The real underlying message here, though, for Canada is it's going to be very hard for us, since we're not really used to working that closely with a lot of these European allies. And that's the shift that we need to undertake.
You mentioned in the article NORAD and the command structure of NORAD, which I wasn't familiar with. If Russia attacked something in the Arctic, or did something not even maybe militarily attack, but brought a submarine or a ship into territory that we thought was Canadian, could we do something without permission and support from the United States?
We could. So let's assume right now the way NORAD works is it's a binational command, which means that the commander NORAD answers both to the United States president and to the Canadian Minister of National Defense and Prime Minister.
But the commander is American most of the time, if not all the time.
The commander is always American, and the deputy commander is always Canadian. But let's say that broke down. Let's say President Trump just gets rid of the command. Typically, if you're answering, or if you have a ship, a military ship, or a ship that you have concerns about that's in your Arctic waters, you would send up a fighter. So we do have the CF-18s still. They're aging, but they could still go out and take a look what's going on. The larger concern, as you pointed out, are things like submarines. We don't have nuclear submarines that can stay under ice in the Arctic. We have no plans to acquire them. Really, the main deterrent effect we have in those waters are British, American, French submarines. But the reality is that Russian and Chinese submarines are probably operating up there all the time, and there's very little that we could do. So there's a number of things that we need to be able to build up to be able to act more independently there. We're building up far more Coast Guard icebreakers, but what are we doing militarily, and what's our ability to respond? It's fairly limited right now.
Now, you didn't say this in your article, but there was another article just across the page from yours that was saying that we actually should be developing a nuclear capability. What do you think of that?
I think it would be a bit of a distraction, to be honest. I think we need to spend our defense dollars building up more autonomous capability on the conventional side. The level of effort, time, intensity, and public support required to develop a Canadian nuclear capability would be massive. And I worry that it would take us away from building up conventional capabilities and sustaining support for that over the long term. And more to the point, I don't see how we would use them in a continental context against a foe.
So one of the things that was talked about, our former and current Minister of Defense said, I think last week, that he was asked to take a look at the new jets that we're going to buy. My understanding is it took a long time to finally decide that we were going to buy jets, let alone these jets, and that they are American, and that there was a whole bunch of rationale to buy the American jets because of everything that you've just mentioned in regards to, maintenance and transferability and applicability in a combined force. But given what you've just said, should we change all that? He says we're looking at it. Should we change it and buy these Swedish jets?
I think we're in a really tough bind, to be honest. So to your point, we delayed this decision by 10, 15 years longer than it should have taken. And as a result of that, our current fighter fleet, the CF-18s, are really at the end of their lives. So when people hear that, the CF-18s are being retired in 2032, I think they think that the entire fleet is just then going to be some desert somewhere. But that's not the reality. The reality is, as the F-35s start coming online next year, you're going to see a series of F-18s that are really at the very end of their lives start to get retired. And we have very good understanding of just how poorly these jets are performing or not. We've become experts at it. But if we were to stop the F-35 purchase at 16, we'd need to very quickly figure out a way to bring on some alternative fighter. Otherwise, our current fleet would really be stretched to the max, and we'd have almost another Sea King situation on our hands, where we're trying to keep a very, very old aircraft flying well beyond its safety. And people assume, well, the Swedish jet was second in the competition last time, therefore we should just give the contract to them. Unfortunately, it probably doesn't work like that. You'd probably have different requirements this time, and you'd need to run a different competition. And it would be difficult for us to go to the French and the British, who we're trying to partner with, and say, well, we're not interested in your jets. We're just going to go with the Swedes. The reason that the Eurofighter and the Rafale from France and UK, respectively, didn't participate was that they thought it'd be too expensive for them to win the contract. They didn't think that they were cost efficient enough. They may want to take another go at it, though, if the requirements change. So simply abandoning the F-35, I understand the sentiment, but we run a risk of leaving ourselves without a viable fighter force for some time. And the larger point, Brian, to be honest, is that the F-35 is just one piece of this. The reality is that dependence on American parts, technology, data is across almost all the new capabilities that we've been acquiring since 2017. Our maritime patrol aircraft, same thing. Our surveillance aircraft for the special operations forces, same dependence. Again, our satellite communications, our encrypted radios, whatever it is, all of these operate with proprietary American data, or at least that we have permission from them to use them. So the United States has this leverage over us in a number of different areas, not simply fighter aircraft. So we just have to bear that in mind.
Okay, so what the blank do we do? My understanding is that, as you say, it's proprietary data, that the computer codes are resident in the United States, and they could turn our jets off. That's not an independent fighting force.
Well, they probably couldn't turn off the jet altogether. What they could do is just make it really difficult to maintain, at which point you basically can't fly them. But the reality is that the F-35 has parts built throughout the world. So if the United States really decided to get very difficult on that front, they might find themselves with other countries refusing to export parts. Now, they could probably retool and eventually build back up their capability. But the thing with the F-35 in particular is that we're all kind of locked into a bit of mutual dependence here. But I think that the underlying point is correct, namely that there's a vulnerability there. It's not just the F-35, it's almost the entirety of the Canadian Armed Forces. And so you almost need to do a managed short to medium term risk. You need to manage that risk over the next 5 to 10 years while building a more autonomous strategic capability over the next 20. That's really what we're looking at.
Now,
We've put
one of the
ourselves in a
things
tough
that,
spot.
sorry, I apologize. One of the things the
Yep.
Americans have done with their military spending, and we've all heard about it, is use it as a industrial strategy.
Mhm.
My understanding is that Sweden, with these Swedish jets, was going to actually build a significant amount of it in Canada. Why would we not like that as a solution instead of hiring someone that's going to build it in the United States?
Well, it really just came down to the different capabilities of the aircraft. So when you're dealing with something like an F-35, yes, it's a fighter, but it's a different type of fighter than the generations that came before it. So basically, the F-35 is more a sensing platform than it is a combat aircraft. It defeats adversaries by detecting them well before it gets detected and it then shoots them out of the sky with missiles before it's ever seen. Similarly, when it enters adversary airspace, it is able to destroy targets on the ground before it's ever seen. That's the kind of idea. When you're dealing with an older legacy aircraft, a fourth generation, something like a Gripen, it's still very much focused on the performance of the aircraft itself. So the kind of the physical performance of the aircraft, and less so on the very kind of elaborate computing and sensing suite that the F-35 brings. Which isn't to say that it's not a good aircraft. It is. It's just be aware of the fact that you're kind of dealing with a different construct in terms of what the fighter is being used for or how it operates.
Okay, so let me ask you a silly question then, maybe. But there was also a really interesting article this past weekend about drones in Ukraine, and that now Ukraine is producing more drones than anywhere else in the world. That they become almost completely independent of needs for manufacturing, and it would appear supply of parts from elsewhere, and so that they've got this sort of independent, autonomous production of drones. And it was saying that for 20 or 30 kilometers at the front, the drones can on their own seek out almost anyone and anything and destroy it, so that it's changed the front lines of a battlefield fairly dramatically. And these things can be produced for less than $1,000. So do we need to rethink $35 billion or $1 million, whatever it is, expensive jets, and just invest in huge amounts of drones?
We need to do both, to be quite honest. The reality is you still need a piloted platform for certain things. So imagine a scenario where you have a civilian airliner that's been hijacked. You need to send up a piloted aircraft to intercept that jet and have eyes on it, see what it can see in the pilot, in the cockpit, whatever. I know it sounds weird, but I mean, if you're going to make a decision to down a civilian airliner, you want to make sure that your fighter aircraft pilot actually sees what's going on there. You don't want to rely on a drone to do that. And right now, we wouldn't have drones that would have the speed and endurance and capability to do that kind of role. Similarly, you wouldn't send up a drone to intercept a Russian bomber in the Arctic. It just wouldn't be the right platform for that. But you're correct. We need a vast number of unpiloted systems for land operations to assist those fighter aircraft in the air and to assist our future submarines underwater and our ships, our surface ships. We have great Canadian companies doing this too, and yet we're not investing in them. I'm doing another project right now, just looking at kind of agile procurement and how to move things faster. And I came across an amazing Canadian company called Sky Canoe, Indigenous owned business, does these small drones that operate independently of GPS, so can't be jammed. Like, there's a lot of nascent good capability here in Canada. We just haven't invested in it because we've been so focused on playing with the United States that we've neglected a lot of the resident expertise that we have here.
Sky Canoe, I love it.
Yeah,
Seriously,
it's great.
great name. During the pandemic, we thought that we could get PPE. We thought we could get respirators. We thought we could get a whole bunch of equipment that we had developed supply chains with the United States. And then Donald Trump, who was president, hard to remember that time, but Donald Trump, who was president at the time, stopped the exportation of some of that equipment from the United States to Canada because they wanted it for themselves, rather than give it to us. We've had this experience before, haven't we? That we need to think about an independent ability to manufacture vaccines, pharmaceutical products, PPE, etc. So why don't we realize it today that we need to do it in military equipment?
You're right. I mean, we've had a lot of warning signs, right? Which is, I think, part of the really frustrating thing about all this is anybody paying attention to U.S. politics over the past 2 decades has seen that something really odd and ugly has been brewing, and now we're seeing it we're confronted with it head on. And we've been very slow to adapt. So to your point, we've had a number of situations where it should have been clear that we need a lot more self-sufficiency. But, there's this Canadian tendency, right, to not act until it's an absolute crisis. We keep thinking that, again, well, it won't be that bad, or really this isn't the crisis that it's made out to be. It'll pass. And we've become lulled, I think, since 1945 into thinking that things will always get better. The world will keep getting more integrated. And therefore, our military capability is kind of like a luxury, but it's not a necessity. And I think now we're waking up to the fact that no, this is an absolute necessity. And our politicians, I would argue, are still a little bit behind that thought. So they're still talking about reaching 2% of GDP in 2032, for instance, like 7 years away. We need to accelerate this tremendously. When the new parliament comes in, you almost need new legislation to allow for rapid acquisition of some core capabilities with new partners. This isn't the time to dither. And to your earlier point about building an industrial capacity, if some of these industries in Canada get absolutely hammered by the United States and the tariffs, well, it's time to take those workers, those assembly lines, that specialty, and reconfigure them to build self-sufficient Canada, a strong Canada. We have people, we have the knowledge, we have the know-how, we have the facilities. We just need to be ready to make the transition.
Self-sufficient Canada sounds like an objective we should have. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just 2 minutes with our expert who has written really quite a compelling article this past weekend on what we need to do. But it's also this attitudinal change that he talks about in the institutions at Canadian National Defence and the Canadian Armed Forces and in the Parliament of Canada and the Government of Canada in regards to changing course and becoming more independent and self-sufficient. It's going to be an interesting challenge to see if it can actually happen and whether we can get out of this attitude of, well, it's just a joke to it's something we need to do. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. My guest tonight is Philippe Lagasse. He is an associate professor at Carleton University in the Barton Chair at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He, along with his co-author, Peter Jones, have written a really fascinating article this past weekend called Wanted, New Allies. And he's talking about, in great detail, it's a very long and in-depth article about what we need to do in Canada, what he thinks we need to do in Canada to separate out from the United States in regards to our defense. You talk about this sort of challenge. I've met some people in the Canadian Armed Forces, and they talk with pride about the role they've played in Afghanistan, working shoulder to shoulder with not just America, but with our allies. I think only once in the last, I don't know, several decades have we really had an independent point of view, and that was in regard to Iraq and Jean Chrétien saying we would not go to Iraq. But we got a lot of opposition at that point in time from the United States and from Americans. And I remember some Americans. I do a lot of business in the United States. Americans took it personally that we didn't follow their lead in going into the Iraqi war. And I think they had a similar attitude towards some of the allies in Europe that either did or did not go. Tell me, how difficult is this attitudinal separation if we were going to do it? And you think about, you mentioned it earlier, and you mentioned in your article, a lot of people saying, oh, Trump's just a joke, or this too will pass, or, it's in 2 years are the midterms and his whole, base will change. Tell me how difficult a change you're talking about.
Well, it's a huge one, right? I mean, it really does require almost a monumental shift. We talk about it in the article, like in terms of trying to move an oil tanker. I mean, to steer it in a different direction. It's a very apt kind of analogy. We're talking about changing a fundamental view of the world, and it's not dissimilar, Ryan, to the change that we had to go through from being kind of a dominion of the British Empire that fought along the UK up to the Second World War. And after that, moving to the American orbit. And just for your listeners to recall, from 1945, it took us about 40 years to even really get into free trade with the United States after that. And that's after the United Kingdom pretty much walked away from us, right, after the Second World War. That's how long it kind of took us to say, okay, now the continent the continental future is our future, to really think in those terms. So I'm hoping it wouldn't take as long, and there will always be those voices. And I think that we're already hearing them. People who have simply see this as an aberration, think that the Americans will eventually wake up, and everything will return to normal. And as much as I sympathize with that view and I somewhat agree, I think there will be a pushback eventually from the American people. And we probably will end up with a Democratic president again that will try and right a lot of the wrongs that were done. But the reality is the following, and even some Americans are pointing this out. How can we ever trust the United States again? How can we trust that they will not elect another Trump-like figure who will again tear up trade agreements, disparage us, threaten to annex us, or whatever it is? The trust that has been fundamentally broken between our two countries on account of the lack of opposition to what he's doing, the lack of checks and balances, is profound. And I think that's what we're dealing with, is if we don't seize this opportunity to reorient ourselves and become more self-sufficient, then we're exposing ourselves needlessly to more coercion in the future from an ally that has shown itself to be fickle, to say the least, and able to elect somebody and not oppose somebody right now who is doing massive damage.
I do a fair amount of business in the United States, as probably a lot of people in Canada do. And so I communicate, interact, go visit, the US and my American business partners on a fairly frequent basis. And there are people that think that this will just pass and that, just be patient, Brian, don't worry. It's, the midterms will discipline him, etc. But there's a lot of people that support him. And I'm not sure Canadians realize how many people in the United States, particularly in those red states, but even in blue states, where there are a lot of people that, say, Brian, you would be better as part of the United States, and actually believe this idea of annexation. And maybe they don't believe it yet in Canada, but they think for sure Greenland and Panama are slam dunk territories that should be part of the United States and would be far better off, and that believe his whole national security argument in regards to Greenland, and will show me on maps how planes or ships coming from Russia go right by Greenland, and clearly it makes economic and security sense. What do you say to that?
No, I think you're right. And the thing to recognize is we in Canada and in Europe have always benefited from a benign United States. The rest of the world hasn't, right? If you're in the global south, you've dealt with a United States that has been very heavy-handed, gets its way, and has consistently used coercion from the Cold War on to get you to align itself or to impose its preferences on you. I mean, we can point to a number of examples of this. And what we're living through now is that propensity in the American populace and within their political class. They're just expanding that approach beyond the global south to their allies. So we're now increasingly going to be treated in the same way that a Panama, a Cuba, a Chile would be. And I think that's where we're having so much difficulty.
We'd be treated the same way a Panama would be treated.
Well, we are right now, right? I think this is why we're having so much cognitive dissonance. I think we always assumed that the United States just saw us as one of them, or so close to them that they would never treat us differently.
Is that how Ukraine felt about Russia? 1 in 4 Ukrainians has a blood relative living in Russia. I've done business in Ukraine and Kyiv. Half, if not more, of the banks were Russian. There was like unbelievable close economic ties because they were one country at one point in time. Is that the same situation?
Well, look, I'll just provide a historical kind of comparison here. On the eve of the First World War, right, the royal families of the United Kingdom and Germany were pretty much, so closely intertwined that there was always, I mean, royal families across Europe, right? That, well, my God, they're family. I mean, literally. But and our economies were so interconnected leading up to the First World War that it seemed impossible that all that could fall away and that animosity would settle in. And yet it did, right? I think we've been accustomed to the idea that we're an exception to history, that history is never going to come back, that we're just on a trajectory towards ever greater prosperity and ever greater peace. And there's a strong segment in the United States population that never viewed the world that way, that still views the world as a strong competition. They see China there and they go, we need to do whatever we can to protect ourselves and fight for our dominance. And countries like ours that are relatively small are seen as impediments by this new political movement in the United States, not as friends and allies. And you hear it. The emphasis is on power and strength. I mean, I personally think that they're undermining their own objectives over the long term because they are killing one of the strongest parts of the United States' foreign policy, namely its alliances and power to influence people diplomatically. But it has a strong support in the United States, and it's always been there, just towards other countries. We're now just shocked that it's being turned towards us.
I think a lot of the focus in the next month in this election is going to be about trade, but I think it's also got to be about exactly this topic: our defense, our sovereignty, our separation of our military capability. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments where I'm going to ask our expert, what the heck should we do next? Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So we've been chatting with Philippe Lagasse. He's an associate professor at Carleton University. He's written a really fascinating column this past weekend on what we need to do from a Canadian military defense standpoint in separating our military and our defense administration and equipment, et cetera, from the United States. And so, sir, the Prime Minister, I don't know who it's going to be, but the Prime Minister calls you into his office in a month's time and says, okay, buddy, what do I do now? I'm now the new Prime Minister. You told me a month ago we need to separate out. I've got the mandate that I need. I got to come out with a throne speech, a budget, etc. I got to figure out what to do with these jets, with these submarines, with the Canadian Armed Forces. You're the expert. Give me a couple-point plan in what I should do.
So number one, get Parliament to give you the authority to make rapid acquisitions of military equipment and to give Cabinet the discretion to do it, notwithstanding all the laws and treaties that we have in place that usually prevent us from making decisive choices. And then you have, I would say, 3 really big projects, military projects on the go that you can leverage to start building some real relationships outside of the United States. Submarines, number one. So do we want to build them with the Germans, the French, the South Koreans, whichever? Start building that relationship. Main battle tanks. There again, who are you working with to do that? Can you start building maybe some of them in Canada? Can you build up that capacity in Canada, working with, again, a European or an Asian ally? Early warning aircraft that we're going to buy. Bombardier makes a great one with the Swedes, also works with the Germans. We should be, building relationships there. Then satellite capability, get an independent launch capability going, so that we can put our own satellite communications up and work with our European allies to do something similar. Build a foreign human intelligence service. We're incredibly dependent on the United States for all sorts of intelligence. What if they cut us off? We need to start having our own version of MI6, the CIA, or the Australian Foreign and Human Intelligence Service. Not because we want to do James Bond stuff. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a foreign human intelligence service that can be mindful of our interests overseas and threats to those interests. So start building that up. And people say, oh, well, Canada could never do that. Well, the Australians can do it. The French can do it. The Germans can do it. The Italians can do it. The British can do it. Are we really incapable of doing it? No, we've just chosen not to do it because it's just been easy to free ride once again on everybody else. Finally, I would say identify those places where we can cooperate really well with allies, and we've already seen that happening. So we've gone over to Europe and we're starting to figure out ways to cooperate with them. I'll give a good example of one area where we should be working. The Italians, the British, and the Japanese are cooperating on a sixth generation fighter aircraft called the Tempest. We need to knock on that door and say, how do we play in this? How do we get in there? Not necessarily because we want to build these things tomorrow, but because it's that kind of relationship that you leverage to build up other types of expertise and other type of capabilities and other ways of fostering new alliances. So there's tons of opportunities out there. We just have been really hesitant, and now's the time to be bold.
And to those that say, Trump is just joshing, he's just joking, he's just trying to get a better deal on trade, your retort is?
If that were the case, he would have had many other ways to do it. If that's just what he wanted, he could have done exactly what he did in his first term and just reopened the agreement. Insisted that, he was going to make changes, and that's the way that it was going to be. There was absolutely no need for any of this. And I think that's the real difference there, Brian, is Trump could have achieved all his objectives with us with a different approach, and we would probably have been very willing. I mean, you listen to Premier Ford. Premier Ford would be willing to, build a fortress North America and give, really integrate with the United States to fight China. I mean, there was a strong support in Canada for that kind of approach.
Kevin O'Leary, Dianne Francis, the Premier of Alberta. There's lots of people that have been talking about economic, customs union, getting closer to the United States.
There was so much low-hanging fruit for President Trump when it came to Canada. So many ways that he could have approached it differently, but he chose not to. And he chose not to for a reason, I would say. And I think that's what we need to bear in mind.
Professor Lagasse, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for this incredibly detailed and very good article. And thank you for raising our awareness, because I do think this is going to be the issue, maybe along with trade, but the issue of the next 30 days as we go through this election campaign. And I think this is going to be the most important election campaign probably since 1988, the free trade election. And I think we are going to have to demand of the people that want to be our prime minister and the people that want to represent us in government, their points of view, their policies, their objectives on not only trade and an independent trade policy, but exactly what the professor talks about, this more independent, if not completely independent, defense capability. And we're going to have to confront this reality that we're faced with. And this, in the next 30 days, is the best time for us to do so. Thank you for joining us. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website and on social media and on YouTube as soon as the radio show goes to air. Good night, everybody. Professor, thank you so much.
Thanks again.